There is a kind of quiet that only exists on land nobody else wants. Not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of a place that has already decided it will not surprise you. Ezra Colton had lived inside that particular silence for 11 years, and by the time this story starts, he had stopped expecting it to break. New Mexico Territory, 1883. Ezra was 36 years old, and he had spent 15 of those years working land that belonged to other men. He had mended other men's fences, birthed other men's calves, buried 2 of his own brothers in soil he did not own, and slept in bunkhouses where his name was one of 6 on a chalk slate nobody bothered to read twice. When his uncle died without children of his own, the deed to 60 acres of scrub and creek bottom passed to Ezra, and for the first time in his life, he owned something. He had thought that would feel like arrival. Instead, it felt like standing in a house with the furniture removed, aware of every echo his own boots made on the floor. He built a barn with his own hands that first year. He liked the sound the hammer made striking a nail into wood that was his. It rang different than it had on someone else's land, sharper somehow, like the wood itself knew the difference between borrowed and owned. He told himself that sound was enough. Most nights it almost was. The valley around his 60 acres had a name that outsiders got wrong more often than right: Cienegila Seca, the dry marsh, though there was nothing marsh-like about it anymore. The creek ran low most of the year and disappeared entirely by August. Ezra had learned to read the sky the way another man might read a ledger, counting what little the land offered him and never once complaining, because complaining was a luxury for men who had someone to complain to. His days had a shape to them that he could have drawn from memory. Up before light, coffee boiled black and drunk, standing at the window, stock-checked, fence-walked, supper eaten alone at a table built for 4. He had made that table himself, out of pine, from a stand of trees near the creek. And he had never once asked himself why a man living by himself needed 4 chairs. It was simply what a table was supposed to have. He kept them dusted anyway. He had courted a woman once, briefly, when he was 23 and still worked for wages on the Halloran spread 2 counties east. Her name did not matter anymore, not the way it once had. What mattered was the letter she sent when her family moved on to California, thanking him kindly and explaining with more grace than the situation required that a hired hand with no land of his own was not a future her father would allow her to choose. He had not blamed her. He had simply understood, in the plain way a man understands weather, that some doors closed on account of what a person had rather than who he was. And he had stopped knocking on doors like that ever since. I want to stop here for just a moment. This story has found listeners in Brazil, in Nigeria, in India, in the Philippines, in Mexico, in South Africa, in places I never imagined a quiet man and his 60 acres could reach. And if you're one of them, watching tonight, hearing this story for the first time, this channel is still young. We're just getting started. If this story has found a place in your heart, hit subscribe before you go anywhere. It helps more than you know, and it means we get to keep bringing you nights like this one. Now let's get back, because Ezra's silence was about to end, and he had no warning at all that it would. It was late October when she appeared at his gate. He had been out checking the last stretch of fence line before the light went, and when he turned back toward the house, he saw her standing at the edge of his property, still as a fence post herself, watching him with an expression he could not read from that distance. She did not call out. She did not move closer. She simply waited, the way a person waits when they have already learned that moving too fast toward a stranger's house can be answered with violence. Her name was Chia. He would not learn that until later. What he saw first was a woman perhaps 10 years younger than himself, wrapped in a blanket the color of dried grass, her dark hair loose and tangled from travel, her feet wrapped in leather that had clearly walked further than leather, like that was built to walk. She held herself carefully, one arm curved low and protective in a way he noticed but did not yet understand. And there was an exhaustion in her posture that went past tired feet, the kind of exhaustion that lives in the bones. "I mean you no trouble," she said, in English worn smooth by a trading post accent, before he had even reached the gate. "I only need somewhere to stop for the night. I will be gone by morning." Ezra had grown up in a territory where the newspapers ran stories about raids and reprisals in the same breath as advertisements for feed corn, where fear of the Apache bands still living off reservation land was treated as common sense, rather than what it actually was, which was mostly rumor stacked on rumor. He had never had reason to test what he believed against an actual person standing in front of him. He found, standing at his own gate with the last light going orange behind her, that he did not feel afraid. He felt something closer to recognition. She looked like a person who had run out of places to be turned away from. And he understood that feeling better than he understood almost anything else in his life. "Where are you headed?" he asked, instead of answering her. "Away," she said. It was the only word she offered, and something in the flatness of it told him not to ask again. He should have sent her on. He knew that, even as he was already stepping back from the gate to let her through. Sheltering an Apache woman, even for one night, was the kind of thing that could bring trouble to a man's door in this territory. Trouble with soldiers from Fort Selden riding patrol lines looking for any excuse to prove they were needed. Trouble with neighbors who had their own reasons to want him gone from land they'd always thought should have stayed unclaimed. He knew all of this. He opened the gate anyway. "There's a room off the barn," he said. "Not much, but it's dry and there's a stove." She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for the catch in the offer. The price that always came attached to shelter for a woman traveling alone. When she did not find one, something in her shoulders came down half an inch, the smallest possible surrender to relief. "Thank you," she said. And that was all either of them said that first night. She stayed a week longer than either of them had planned. It happened the way these things happen, not through any single decision, but through 100 small ones, each easier to make than the one before it. On the second morning, she was already up before him, and he woke to the smell of coffee made stronger and better than his own, and a pan of cornmeal cakes cooling on the stove that he had not asked for and did not know how to refuse. She began cooking in the mornings as a matter of course. Small economical meals that made his own cooking look like waste. He began leaving the good axe out where she could reach it instead of the dull one, a courtesy he did not examine too closely at the time. On the fourth day, he found her mending a torn section of the corral fence with a skill that surprised him, lashing the rail with wet rawhide the way he had never learned to do properly himself. She caught him watching, and for the first time since she'd arrived, something close to a smile crossed her face. "You watch me like I might vanish," she said. "Folks who show up sudden tend to leave sudden," he answered. "I've learned not to get used to things." "Then we are alike in that," she said, and went back to her work, and he thought about that sentence for the rest of the day. By the end of that first week, a rhythm had settled over the place that Ezra had not felt since before his brothers died. She rose before him and had the stove going. He split more wood than the house needed because splitting wood gave his hands something to do while his mind worked through the question of how long a person was allowed to let a stranger become less of a stranger. In the evenings, she taught him a handful of words in her own language, patient with his poor imitation of the sounds, and in return he taught her the names of every tool in his barn, some of which made her laugh outright. The first sound he had heard from her that carried no caution in it at all. Your word for hammer sounds like a sneeze, she told him once, and he had laughed so hard at that he dropped the hammer in question on his own boot, which made her laugh harder still. She spoke little of where she had come from, and he did not press her, understanding instinctively that a person only tells you the truth of their leaving once they trust you will not use it against them. What he noticed instead, in those first days, were the small habits she carried that spoke louder than any explanation. She never sat with her back to the door. She counted the days by notching a stick she kept in her blanket roll, a habit he recognized because he had once done something similar himself. The winter after his second brother died, when marking time was the only proof he had that he was still moving through it and not simply standing still inside his own grief. This is the second story on this channel to reach for a hook like this one, an unlikely arrival, a door that opens when the smarter choice would have been to keep it shut. If you like stories like this, subscribe and leave a like. It helps the channel find more people like you. And I'd love to know. Leave a comment and tell me, what's the bravest door you've ever opened for a stranger, even when every practical bone in your body told you not to? I like knowing these stories travel to every corner of the world and land differently in each one. Now let's get back, because the reason Chia had left her own people was not something she was ready to say out loud yet, and it would not stay hidden much longer. The truth came out in pieces, the way most true things do. Her husband, a man named Tosi, had been killed that spring in a confrontation with a cavalry supply column that had strayed onto land the band considered theirs by right, though no paper anywhere agreed with them. It had not been a battle so much as a misunderstanding that ended the way misunderstandings between armed and frightened men often ended in that decade. Tosi had not been the aggressor. It had not mattered. He was dead within a week of it, and Chia was left a widow inside a band that was already fracturing under the pressure of soldiers, drought, and an elder named Bidaga, who had grown convinced that any further contact with the army, even accidental, even one-sided, would bring the full weight of Fort Selden down on all of them. Bidaga had looked at Chia, grieving and increasingly unwell, and had seen not a widow to be cared for, but a woman connected, by marriage and by blood, to the very trouble he feared most. It was not cruelty exactly, not the way Ezra had always imagined cruelty to look. It was fear wearing the mask of caution, a frightened old man making a hard choice to protect the people he was responsible for and deciding that Chia's safety was a cost he was willing to pay for it. He had given her supplies for a week and told her, not unkindly, that she would be safer finding her own way than staying where soldiers might come looking again. 2 other families in the band had argued against him. It had not mattered either. Bidaga's word carried weight enough to settle it. And Chia had walked out of the only camp she had left with a blanket, a knife, and a week of dried meat, moving south and east toward the trading posts, because that was the direction away from where the soldiers had last been seen. She did not tell Ezra all of this at once. She told him about Tosi first, on a night when the wind was loud enough to cover the shake in her voice. She told him about Bidaga weeks later, and only after Ezra had proven, through nothing more dramatic than consistency, that he was not going to ask her to leave the moment her welcome grew inconvenient. "You could have told me you were widowed," he said once gently,
Thank you, Ezra.
"and left the rest
I
out.
believe you.
I wouldn't have asked more."
I will go.
"I know." she said. "That is why I told you the rest." Word travels fast in a valley with only so many roads through it. And by the second week of November, most of Chenegila Seca knew an Apache woman was staying on Ezra Colton's land. The reactions split along lines that surprised him. Old Mrs. Abernathy, who ran the dry goods counter at the post and had buried a husband and two sons of her own to a winter not unlike the one bearing down on them now, sent out a sack of flour with no note attached. Only a message passed through her grandson that it was for the household, whatever that household looks like these days. Reverend Cole, who preached fire on Sundays and had never once visited Ezra's land in 11 years, rode out specifically to inform him that Scripture had plenty to say about consorting with heathens and left without being asked to stay for coffee. Ezra did not argue with him. He had learned a long time ago that men who ride out of their way to deliver an insult are rarely interested in a conversation. Winter came early and hard that year, the kind of winter old-timers in the territory would talk about for a decade after, when creeks froze solid enough to walk on and cattle that wandered too far from a windbreak did not come back. Ezra and Chia spent it working the land together in a partnership that neither of them named out loud, though every neighbor who rode past the property line noticed it and had an opinion. The opinion that mattered came from Silas Reeve, who held the note on 60 acres that Ezra had mortgaged 2 years earlier to buy stock after a bad season. Reeve owned the largest spread in the valley and had wanted Ezra's water rights on Cieneguilla Seca's creek bottom for longer than Ezra had owned them. He rode out on a cold morning in December, ostensibly to discuss the note's interest, and found Chia splitting kindling in the yard with an efficiency that told him everything he needed to know about how settled she'd become. "You know what people are saying," Reeve said to Ezra later, inside the house, his voice pitched low and reasonable, in the way of a man who believes reason is simply his opinion said calmly enough. "Harboring one of them, after what happened to the Wilcox boy 2 counties over." "Nothing happened to any Wilcox boy on my land," Ezra said. "Doesn't matter where it happened. Matters what people believe could happen again, and where. You default on that note come spring, and I'd hate for the county to look too closely at what's been going on out here when they decide who gets first offer on the land." It was not a threat spoken plainly, because men like Reeve rarely spoke plainly. It was a door left open just enough to see the shape of the room beyond it, and the shape of that room was clear enough. Send her away, or risk losing everything Ezra had spent 15 years earning the right to call his own. Ezra did not answer him that day. He walked Reeve to his horse in silence and stood at the gate long after the man had ridden off, looking at the 60 acres that had once felt like the only proof he mattered to anyone. Reeve's foreman, a broad, sunburned man named Otis Grady, rode out alone a few days later while Ezra was away at the mill and found Chia alone in the yard. He did not raise a hand to her. He did not need to. He simply sat his horse close enough to crowd her against the fence rail and told her, in a voice pitched for intimidation rather than volume, that the valley had no place for her kind and that she would do well to be gone before the ground thawed enough to bury whatever trouble she brought with her. Chia did not step back. She looked up at him, steady, and told him in a voice just as even that she had buried a husband already and had no fear left to spend on a man who needed a horse under him to feel brave. Grady left without another word. When Ezra came home and heard what had happened, his hands went white-knuckled on the porch rail. But Chia put a hand over his and told him that the worst thing he could do was ride to Reeve's spread and prove Grady's fear correct. Ezra listened to her. It was, he would say later, one of the harder things he had ever made himself do. Reeve was not finished. 2 weeks later, A corporal from Fort Selden rode out with a small patrol on what the corporal called a routine inquiry, asking after reports of an unregistered Apache woman living outside reservation bounds. Ezra stood on his own porch and answered every question the young corporal asked, plainly and without apology, that a widow had asked for shelter from the cold and he had given it, and that he intended to keep giving it for as long as she needed it. The corporal, who could not have been older than 22 and looked more uncomfortable with the errand than anyone else involved, wrote down what Ezra said, glanced once toward the barn where Chia stood watching from the doorway, and rode back toward the fort without incident. Ezra learned later from Mrs. Abernathy's grandson that it had been Reeve who sent word to the fort in the first place, hoping the visit would end differently than it had. That night, Chia found Ezra still sitting on the porch step long past dark, his breath fogging in the cold, his hands wrapped loosely around a mug of coffee gone cold an hour earlier. "He wants you to send me away," she said. It was not a question. "He wants my water," Ezra said. "I'm just the easiest way for him to get it." "Then let him have an easier way. I have stayed too long already. I told myself one night, and it became a season." "You didn't stay too long," Ezra said, and for the first time since she'd arrived, his voice carried something rougher than politeness. "I never once asked you to leave. I'm not asking now." She looked at him for a long moment in the dark, and something passed between them that neither one gave a name to. Not that night. It was not the kind of moment either of them could afford to name yet. Not with Reeve circling the note and winter still tightening its grip on the valley. But it sat there between them all the same, unspoken and undeniable. What Ezra did not know yet, what Chia had been carrying since before she ever reached his gate, was that she was not traveling alone in the way he had assumed. There had been a reason her steps grew slower each week, a reason she rested more often than the work alone could explain, a reason she kept one arm curved low and careful even when there was nothing in her hands to hold. She had said nothing of it, not out of deception, but because a widow carrying a dead man's child into a stranger's house was a fact too heavy to hand someone before she knew whether his kindness would survive the weight of it. She told him in January, on a night the wind screamed loud enough to rattle the barn door on its hinge, when a fever caught hold of her and would not let go until morning. She told him quietly, without drama, the way she told him everything, watching his face for the moment his welcome would finally run out. It did not run out. He sat with her through that fevered night, replacing cool cloths and keeping the stove fed, boiling willow bark into a bitter tea the way his own mother had taught him for fevers long before she passed. Somewhere past midnight, in the low light of the stove, she asked him plainly why he had not sent her away the moment he understood what she carried. "Same reason I let you through the gate in October," he said. "Never seemed like a decision. Seemed more like the only thing I could have done, and still looked at myself in the shaving mirror after." "That is not an answer men usually give," she said. "Wasn't raised around men who gave many honest ones," he said, and that was the closest either of them came that night to saying the thing neither was ready to name. Somewhere near dawn, when the fever finally broke and she slept without shaking for the first time in hours, he sat back against the wall and let out a breath he felt he had been holding since October. Whatever he felt for her had already grown past the point where a single fact, however heavy, could uproot it. By February, Reeve made good on the shape of his threat, calling the note early on a technicality buried in language Ezra had signed without reading closely enough 2 years before. It would have ruined a man standing alone. Ezra was not standing alone anymore. Chia knew the value of things Ezra had never learned to see, the worth of hides properly cured, of herbs that grew wild along the creek bottom that traders at the post would pay real money for. Skills passed down through a life Ezra had never had reason to understand until he was living beside someone who carried it. She worked alongside him through the worst of that winter with a steadiness that never once slowed, curing 3 hides a week beyond what the ranch itself required and trading them quietly through Mrs. Abernathy, who asked no questions and kept the ledger fair. Between the two of them, working through the worst of that winter with a stubbornness neither Reeve nor the county bank had accounted for, they made the payment 3 days before the deadline in coin at the counter of the very bank that had hoped to see them fail. The clerk who counted it did not hide his surprise. Word of it reached Reeve within the day and reached the rest of the valley within the week. And something in the way the town looked at Ezra Colton began slowly to shift. Not everyone's mind changed. Reverend Cole still crossed the street rather than tip his hat. But enough did change. Enough small kindnesses started arriving unasked. A jar of preserves left at the gate, an offer of help mending a roof, that the two of them stopped bracing quite so hard against every knock at the gate. She named her daughter in the spring, in a quiet ceremony that borrowed pieces from 2 different worlds, because that was the only way it could be done honestly. A few words spoken in the language Tozy had once taught her and a few more in the English she had learned at the trading post, both of them meant the same way. Ezra stood beside her for it, not as a man claiming something that was not his to claim, but as a man who had chosen fully and without being asked twice to belong to whatever came next. They married that summer in the same valley that had once seemed determined to keep them both alone, under a sky that had finally stopped feeling like an accusation and started feeling like a witness. Mrs. Abernathy stood as witness for them both and brought a cake and cried harder than either of the 2 people actually getting married. 2 summers after the naming ceremony, a small party from Bidaga's band passed near the valley on their way to trade at the post, and word reached Chia that the old man himself rode among them, thinner and grayer than she remembered. She almost did not go to meet them. It was Ezra who saddled her horse alongside his own and told her that a woman did not have to forgive a man to let him see that she had survived him. She rode out to the trading post that day, and when Bidaga saw her, whole and steady and plainly cared for, something in his weathered face broke open in a way that looked almost like grief for the harm he had caused. He did not ask forgiveness outright, and she did not offer it outright. But he took her hand in both of his for a long moment, an old man's apology spoken entirely without words, and it was enough for both of them to carry forward from there. Years passed the way years do when a person finally stops counting the lonely ones. The barn Ezra had built with his own hands that first solitary year still stood, weathered now, expanded twice over. And the sound a hammer made against its wood had long since stopped ringing like an echo in an empty house. It rang now like something ordinary, something owned by more than one person, something that no longer needed to prove anything to the silence around it. The table he had built for 4, all those lonely years ago, no longer sat empty most evenings, and he never did tell anyone how strange and how right that felt. After so many years of dusting chairs nobody used. Reeve sold his spread and left the valley within 3 years. Having never managed to pry loose the water rights he'd wanted so badly, and the valley did not much mourn his going. Mrs. Abernathy lived long enough to see the ranch prosper past anything Ezra had imagined possible that first cold October and she never once let either of them forget that she had believed in the household, whatever it looked like, from the very start. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the light went gold over land that had finally earned the right to be called generous, Chia would sometimes stand at that same gate where she had once waited, uncertain for a stranger's decision. She was never uncertain there anymore. It was simply the place where once everything had changed. And she liked, on the good evenings, to remember it exactly as it had been, not as a threshold she had crossed out of desperation, but as the first place in a long time that had chosen to see her rather than turn her away. The valley that had once debated whether Ezra Colton's household deserved a place among them eventually stopped debating it at all. Even Reverend Cole, in his last years, was known to tip his hat when he passed the Colton wagon on the road into town, though he never did explain what changed his mind, and Ezra never asked. Some doors, he had learned, opened slowly enough that you only noticed they'd moved at all once you were already standing on the other side. I have told a lot of stories on this channel about people who found each other in unlikely places, but I keep coming back to this one because I think most of us know what it feels like to stand at somebody's gate, uncertain whether we'll be let in or sent away. What Ezra and Chia's story taught me is that the bravest thing a person can do is not the grand gesture everyone expects. It is the small, quiet decision to open a door when closing. It would have been so much easier to explain. If you've ever been on either side of that gate, waiting or deciding, I hope tonight's story found you the way it was meant to. Until the next one, take care of the doors you're given the chance to open.